The stars in the outer Hellion corridor did not move. They never did. They just hung there in the black like cold fire, millions of miles apart, indifferent to everything that passed between them. No sound, no wind, nothing but the slow, endless silence of deep space. It was in this silence that Fleet Admiral Jaketh stood on the bridge of his flagship and felt, for the first time in many years, something close to pleasure. He was tall, even by Vreth standards. His skin was the color of slate after rain, a dark gray-blue that deepened at the joints and along the ridges of his jaw. His eyes were wide and pale, almost white, the kind of eyes that had looked at many things and found most of them unworthy of extended attention. He had 4 arms, as all Vreth did, and he kept the lower pair folded behind his back in a habit so old it had become part of how others recognized him from a distance. The upper pair he used to gesture, to point to command. He had been commanding for a long time. 31 years in the Vreth Dominion's military. 11 systems brought under Dominion control. 3 species made to kneel and 2 others that had been erased entirely because kneeling was not in their nature. He had never lost an engagement, not once. Not even the small ones that other admirals dismissed as routine. He treated every encounter the same way he had treated the first one when he was young and unknown and hungry, with total focus, with complete intent. Now he stood on the bridge of the Endless Dominion, his flagship, 700 meters long, crewed by 4,000 Vreth soldiers and officers, and looked through the forward viewport at a single human ship drifting alone in the dark. It was not moving. It sat in space the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river, passive, still. Its running lights blinked slowly, a dull amber rhythm that was almost lazy in how steady it was. The ship was long and angular, built without the curves that most Vreth vessels favored, all flat panels and hard edges, like someone had decided that beauty was not a military requirement. It was painted a dark gray that made it difficult to see against the black of space unless you were looking for it. Jaketh was looking for it. He had been looking for it for 6 hours. His armada had picked up the vessel's energy signature near the edge of the Hellion corridor 3 days ago, and he had spent those 3 days calculating. The corridor was a stretch of space that the Vreth Dominion considered theirs by proximity, though no formal boundary had been established. Humanity, that young, fumbling species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel within the last 80 of their short years, had apparently decided to push a ship through it without asking permission. Typical, Jaketh had thought when the report first crossed his desk. Young species always did things like this. They didn't understand the rules because they hadn't been taught the rules yet. That was fine. Teaching was something the Vreth were very good at. He had brought 7 ships. Not because he expected a fight, he didn't, but because 7 ships sent a message more clearly than 2. He wanted the humans to understand, when they saw his armada come out of faster-than-light transit, exactly what kind of situation they were in. He wanted the math to be obvious. One of them, 7 of us, go home. But the human ship had not run when his armada appeared. It had not raised its shields. It had not charged its weapons, or at least, the passive energy readings his scouts were getting didn't suggest any weapons were being charged. It had simply continued to drift, running lights blinking, doing absolutely nothing. Jaketh had waited. He was patient. He could wait. The ship continued to do nothing. He had sent a standard hailing frequency, the kind the Vreth used with all new species, a mathematical sequence, then a greeting in 3 dominant galactic languages, then a request for identification. Clean, professional. It gave the other side a chance to respond in a way that didn't involve weapons fire. The response had come back in one of those galactic languages, spoken with a human accent that was slightly flat and clipped. A calm voice. Female, he believed, by the structure of the sound. She had identified the ship as the UES Iron Meridian, a warship of the United Earth Sovereignty. She had acknowledged the Vreth Dominion's presence. She had expressed no alarm. That was when Jaketh had decided to run a deep scan. It was standard procedure. Before boarding a vessel, which was what he planned to do, since a single human ship in Vreth-claimed territory was technically a violation that gave him full authority to act. He always ran a complete scan. He wanted to know what he was dealing with. He wanted to know the ship's power levels, its weapon systems, its crew count, its structural weaknesses. It made the boarding cleaner. It made the whole thing more efficient. He had called for Prith. Sensor Analyst Prith was not a soldier. He was a technician, which in the Vreth military hierarchy placed him several rungs below the officers and commanders, but several rungs above the maintenance crews. He was younger than most people on the bridge, with the narrower frame that came from spending most of one's career sitting at a console rather than training in the physical conditioning programs. His eyes were a darker shade than Jaketh's, almost navy blue, and they moved quickly, always processing, always reading. He was the best scanner operator in the fleet, which was the only reason Jaketh tolerated his occasional habit of asking questions before acting on orders. Prith had set up the deep scan array without comment. He understood what was being asked of him. He pulled the array's power draw up to full capacity, aligned the sensor clusters with the drifting human ship, and began the process. A deep scan was not like a simple radar sweep. It didn't just bounce a signal off the surface and measure what came back. It pushed focused energy through a vessel's hull in waves, each wave tuned to a different frequency, each one designed to reveal a different type of information. Hull composition, internal structure, power systems, life signs, weapon loads, engine configuration. It was, in effect, a complete and total examination of everything a ship was and everything it contained. It took time. For a vessel the size of the Iron Meridian, a thorough deep scan would take somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. Prith started the timer and watched his screens. Sub-Commander Verak stood a few meters away, watching Prith work. Verak was older than most of the bridge crew, with the thick neck and heavy jaw of someone who had come up through ground combat before transitioning to fleet service. He was not a thinker in the way that Prith was a thinker, but he was sharp, and he noticed things that other people missed. He had noticed, for example, that the human ship had not reacted at all when the scan array powered up. Most vessels, even friendly ones, registered some kind of response when they were being deep scanned. It was like being stared at in a room full of people. You usually felt it. The Iron Meridian did not seem to feel it. Or Verak thought it felt it and simply did not care. He kept that thought to himself. Jaketh didn't like unnecessary commentary during operations. On the bridge of the Iron Meridian, Commander Alara Voss sat in her command chair and listened to her ship breathe. Every ship had a sound. The Iron Meridian sound was a low, constant vibration that came up through the chair, through the floor, through the walls, the sound of the 3 fusion cores running at idle, the sound of the life support cycling, the sound of nearly 2,000 people going about their duties in the disciplined, quiet way that long service in deep space tended to produce. It was a sound Voss had lived with for 11 years on various ships, and she found it more comforting than silence. She was not a tall woman. She was average height for a human, lean rather than broad, with dark brown skin and close-cut natural hair that she kept neat because regulation required it, and because she had never much cared for fussing with it. Her eyes were a very ordinary brown. She was 43 years old. She had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not because she was hiding things, but because she had long ago learned that a commander's expression was something the crew watched constantly, and there was no point in frightening people with your own uncertainty. She had been watching the Vreth Armada since it dropped out of faster-than-light transit 6 hours ago, 7 ships. She had counted them carefully. She had run her own passive scans, nothing that would provoke them. Just the standard electromagnetic reads that any ship did automatically, and she had built a picture of what she was looking at. The Vreth flagship alone was almost 4 times the length of the Iron Meridian. The 6 escort vessels were each roughly equivalent to her ship in size, maybe slightly larger. All 7 were armed. All 7 had their weapon systems in a standby configuration, not fully charged but not fully cold either. Ready, but waiting. She had received the hailing signal and responded to it. She had kept her voice even and her words simple. She had given her ship's name and her government's name, and she had not asked what the Vreth wanted because it was fairly obvious what they wanted. They wanted her to leave. She was not going to leave. Her orders were specific. She was in the Hellion corridor because Admiral Harkin had put her there on purpose. The Vreth had been expanding their claimed territory in slow, careful increments for the past decade, pushing their borders a little further each year into space that no formal treaty had assigned to anyone. They did it quietly, one system at a time, waiting to see if anyone pushed back. Most species didn't. Most species saw the size of the Vreth Dominion and decided that the corridor, or the system, or the planet wasn't worth the argument. Harkin had decided it was time to push back. Not with aggression, not with a declaration, just with presence, just with the simple, physical fact of a human warship sitting in the space that the Vreth were quietly claiming and not moving when asked. And then letting them scan it. That part of the order had surprised Voss when Harkin first gave it. She had sat across from the Admiral in his office on Earth Station 1 and listened to him lay out the mission. And when he got to the part about allowing a full deep scan without raising shields or initiating any countermeasures, she had said, simply and clearly, "Sir, that will show them everything." Harkin had looked at her for a moment before answering. He was a big man, older, with gray in his hair and the kind of quiet that came from having made very hard decisions over a very long career. He had nodded slowly and said yes. That was the point. She had wanted to ask more questions. She had about 6 of them lined up behind her teeth. But something in the way he'd said it, the complete, unhurried certainty of it, had made her close her mouth and sit with it for a moment. And the longer she sat with it, the more she began to understand. The Vreth had spent 3 centuries building a reputation. The reputation was the weapon. You didn't have to fight every species. You just had to make sure every species knew what had happened to the ones you had fought. The reputation did the rest. Humanity was building a reputation too. It was just a different kind. Voss opened a ship-wide channel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, the system carried sound perfectly well. She said, "Let them look, all of it." And then she closed the channel and settled back in her chair and listened to her ship breathe and waited. On the Endless Dominion, the deep scan continued. Data moved across Prith's screens in slow, steady columns. Hull composition results first. That was always the quickest layer to read. Prith had run this scan on dozens of vessels over his career, from tiny mining ships to full military cruisers. He knew what the numbers usually looked like. He knew the standard ranges. He looked at the first set of numbers, coming back from the Iron Meridian's hull analysis. He looked at them for a long moment. He ran the calibration check on his instruments, because he was a careful technician, and the first thing you did when you got a number that didn't fit your expectations was check that your instruments were reading correctly. The calibration check came back clean. The instruments were fine. He looked at the numbers again. They were not fine. He didn't say anything yet. He was a technician, not an officer. It wasn't his place to say anything until he had more data. He set a flag on the hull composition results and moved to the next layer of the scan, telling himself that there was probably an explanation, that the numbers were unusual but not necessarily alarming, that he should wait for the full picture before drawing any conclusions. He moved to the weapons array data, and the next set of numbers started coming in. He set another flag. Verak, watching from a few meters away, saw the small, barely visible change in Prith's posture. The technician's back had straightened slightly. His lower pair of hands, which had been resting loose on the edge of the console, had curled their fingers inward. Just slightly, just barely. The kind of thing that most people would not notice. Verak noticed it. He moved a step closer and looked at Prith's screen, and even though he was not a scanner specialist and the data on the screen was not laid out in a way that was immediately readable to him, he could see the flagged markers accumulating in the corner of the display. 1, 2, now 3. He looked through the viewport at the human ship. It was still drifting, still calm, still doing nothing. Jacketh was standing near the forward viewport, watching his armada's positioning on a secondary display. 6 of his ships had arranged themselves in a loose arc around the human vessel, not a full encirclement, but enough to communicate the nature of the situation without being formally aggressive. It was a posture he had used many times. It said, "You are surrounded, you are outgunned, make the right choice." He had not looked at Prith's screens. The scan was ongoing. He would review the results when they were complete, as he always did, thorough and orderly. He believed in doing things in the right sequence. He did not notice, at first, that Prith had gone very quiet. The scan continued. The data came in, and with each new layer of information that the deep scan array pulled from the bones of the iron meridian, Prith's hands grew more still, and the flags in the corner of his screen multiplied, and the cold feeling that had started in the base of his neck began moving slowly upward toward the back of his skull. He reached the biological readings, the life sign data, the crew metrics, and the cold feeling reached his eyes. The scan showed 1,847 humans aboard the Iron Meridian. It showed their locations within the ship, their movement patterns, their basic physiological data. And because Prith's scanner array was a military-grade system designed for threat assessment, it also measured something else: the hormonal and neurological markers associated with stress. In every other species Prith had ever scanned during a military standoff, those markers looked a specific way: fear, panic, the biology of a creature that knew it was in danger and was trying to decide whether to run or fight. It was readable, it was predictable. It was, in a strange way, reassuring because it meant the other side understood the situation the same way you did. The human readings did not look like that. 1,847 human beings, surrounded by 7 Vreth warships, deep-scanned without their permission, in a ship sitting alone in the dark millions of miles from anyone who could help them. And their biological readings showed something that Prith's scanner system could not categorize. He stared at the readout. The system was trying to classify it, running it against every category in its database. Fear, no match. Panic, no match. Aggression, no match. Exhaustion, no match. Chemical sedation, no match. The system cycled through its entire library. Then it stopped and produced 2 words in the output box: classification unknown. Prith sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to look for the Admiral. "Fleet Admiral," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, and with a small tremor in it that he had not planned and could not entirely explain. Jacketh turned from the viewport. He saw the look on Prith's face, the careful, controlled look of a technician who had found something he did not know how to explain, and he crossed the bridge in long, measured strides. He looked at the screen. The bridge of the Endless Dominion was not a quiet place under normal circumstances. There were dozens of officers and crew at their stations, monitoring systems, running calculations, communicating with the rest of the armada. There was always sound, always movement. Jacketh read the screen, and then he read it again, and then he stood very still, and somehow the stillness of one man changed the atmosphere of the entire room. People noticed. They always noticed when the Admiral went still. Slowly, without anyone giving an order, the bridge got quieter. Through the viewport, the Iron Meridian drifted on, steady and calm, its amber running lights blinking in that slow, unhurried rhythm, as if it had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry, as if it were waiting for them to finish, as if it had known, before the scan even started, exactly what they would find, and exactly what it would feel like when they found it. Varak stepped up beside the admiral and looked at the screen. He read the numbers. He read the flags. He read the 2 words in the output box. He said nothing. He looked out at the human ship. The scan was not yet complete. There were more layers to go, more data still to come. For the first time in 14 years of fleet service, Sub-Commander Varak found himself not entirely sure he wanted to see what came next. The scan kept running. Prith stayed at his console. He had not moved from his seat in over 20 minutes, which was unusual for him because he was the kind of person who shifted and fidgeted and leaned forward and back when he was thinking. But right now he was not fidgeting. He was sitting very straight and still, his 4 hands arranged neatly on the edge of the console, and he was reading the results as they came in the same way a person might read something that they kept hopping would change if they looked at it long enough. It did not change. Fleet Admiral Jaketh had pulled a chair from a nearby station and placed it beside Prith's console. He did not usually sit near the scan station. He usually stood at the forward viewport or at the command platform in the center of the bridge. But the forward viewport showed him nothing useful, and the command platform felt, in this particular moment, like the wrong place to be. He wanted to see the numbers as they arrived. He wanted to see each layer of data as the scan revealed it, in real time, without waiting for a summary. He had asked Prith to walk him through it, explain each section as it came in. Plain language, no technical shorthand. Prith had nodded and begun. The hull composition results had come first, and Prith had explained them quietly, his voice careful and measured, the voice of someone who was being very deliberate about keeping emotion out of his words. The Iron Meridian's outer hull was not a single material. Most ships used 1 primary alloy, maybe 2, in areas where extra strength was needed. The human ship used 17 different materials, all interlocked at a structural level, each one chosen because of how it behaved in relation to the others. Some were standard metals and composites that the Vreth recognized. Others were not in any Vreth materials database. What the scan could determine from the way the materials interacted with the scan's test frequencies was that the outer hull was not passive armor. It did not simply sit there and absorb impacts. The outer layer, a composite that the scan could not fully classify, responded to energy input. When the deep scan's frequencies passed through it, the material absorbed a portion of that energy and redirected it inward, not randomly, in a specific direction, toward the ship's power grid. Jaketh had looked at Prith when that result came through. Prith had looked back at him with that same careful, controlled expression. "It eats weapons fire," Prith said, because there was no simpler way to say it. Or at least part of it. The directed energy that hits the outer layer, it doesn't just bounce off or damage the hull. Some of it gets absorbed, and then the hull sends it to the ship's power systems. Jaketh had said nothing. He had looked at the numbers for a long moment and then gestured for Prith to continue. The second layer of the scan had covered the ship's internal structure. The frame, the bulkheads, the way the ship was put together on the inside. Prith had run this part of the analysis twice, because the first run produced results that seemed inconsistent with what the outer scan had shown, and he wanted to make sure he wasn't misreading the data. He was not misreading it. The Iron Meridian was divided internally into sections that were individually sealed from each other at a structural level. Not just doors that could close. Actual physical separation. Each section of the ship could be completely isolated from every other section if the situation required it. The materials in the internal bulkheads were different from the outer hull composite, but they shared one characteristic. The scan suggested they were capable of a limited degree of self-repair. Prith had explained this part slowly, because he understood that what he was saying sounded like something from a story rather than from an engineering report. The hull could, under certain conditions, close small breaches on its own. Not large damage. A significant weapon strike would still cause significant damage. But the kind of minor breach that accumulated over the course of a long battle, the small cracks and stress fractures that added up over time and eventually became critical vulnerabilities. The material could address those on its own slowly, while the ship was still fighting. Jacques had asked how that was possible. Prith had said he didn't fully know. The scan could tell him what the material did. It could not tell him with complete certainty how it did it. What he could say was that the structure was unlike anything in Vreth engineering. It was not that the Vreth hadn't thought about self-repairing materials. They had, in theoretical papers, in laboratory experiments. But the practical challenges were enormous, and the Vreth had concluded, several decades ago, that the technology was too complex and too expensive to develop for wide use. The humans had apparently reached a different conclusion. Sub-Commander Verak had come to stand behind them by this point. He had not been invited, but Jacques had not told him to leave, which meant he was allowed to stay. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and read the screen over Prith's shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The weapons data was next. Prith had paused before beginning this section, a small pause, barely more than a breath. Then he had straightened his back a little more and started reading the numbers. The Iron Meridian carried 32 primary weapons, mass driver cannons, arranged in 8 batteries of 4, positioned along the ship's main axis and secondary flanks. The scan had measured the barrel length, the power draw of the electromagnetic coils, the capacity of the ammunition storage systems, and from those measurements, it had calculated a performance estimate. Prith read the performance estimate. Then he read it again. Then he said, very quietly, each cannon can accelerate a 1-ton tungsten projectile to approximately 4% of the speed of light. Jacques said, repeat that. Prith repeated it. 4% of the speed of light. That was not a speed that weapons were supposed to travel at. That was not a speed that weapons practically could travel at, given the engineering involved in the acceleration process, given the power requirements, given the structural stress on the barrel and the frame of the ship during firing. The Vreth's own mass driver technology, which was considered advanced, operated at a fraction of that velocity. Their best weapons moved projectiles at roughly 0.5% of light speed, and that required enormous power draws and had a low rate of fire because the systems needed time to recover between shots. The human cannons, if the scan's estimate was correct, fired at 8 times that velocity. Prith did the math out loud, because math made things feel more real and more manageable than raw numbers, and also because he needed something to do with his hands and his voice while his mind tried to settle. At 4% of light speed, a 1-ton tungsten slug carried kinetic energy measured in the equivalent of many thousands of nuclear warheads. One shot, from one cannon. The Iron Meridian had 32 of them. The combined kinetic yield of a single broadside from the Iron Meridian, all cannons firing at once, exceeded the total firepower of Jacques' entire 7-ship armada. By a significant margin. Verak made a sound. It was not a word. It was just a sound, the kind that comes out of a person when their mind has tried to process something and briefly run out of room. Jacques did not make a sound. He sat very still and looked at the screen. And then he said, the power source. Prith nodded. He had already moved to that section of the scan. 3 fusion cores, he said, each one independent of the others. If one is destroyed, the remaining 2 don't lose power, they increase output and redistribute the load automatically. The switchover time is approximately 1 second. 1 second. In a battle, 1 second was nothing. In 1 second, a ship was either winning or losing or dead, and 1 second of vulnerability in a power system was, in practical terms, no vulnerability at all. Each core can sustain the weapons array at full firing capacity indefinitely, Prith continued. Not for a few shots, not for a limited engagement window, indefinitely, as long as the reactor fuel supply holds, which the scan estimates at. He checked the number twice. Approximately 4 years of continuous combat operation. No one on the bridge said anything for a moment. The